On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann disappeared from a holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal. Within hours, her face was on every screen. Within days, the world had picked sides. Was she abducted by a passing predator? Was it a bungled burglary? Or, as a handful of investigators and analysts have suggested, did something else happen inside apartment 5A? One of the loudest voices challenging the mainstream story is Jon Wedger, a former detective who worked years in child protection and vice squads. In interviews, Wedger argues that key behaviors, timelines, and forensic signals don't fit a clean abduction narrative. He suggests an alternative scenario, one he believes is more consistent with the details and with his experience interviewing traumatized families. Tonight we walk through Wedger's argument, point by point, then set it beside what is known, what is disputed, and what remains unproven. The case of Madeleine McCann is more than just the story of a missing child. It is a global obsession, a media storm, and one of the most polarizing investigations of our time. On the surface, the facts are simple. A 3-year-old girl disappeared from a holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal, in May 2007. But as the years passed, cracks appeared in the narrative, questions multiplied, and theories took root that refused to die. Former UK detective Jon Wedger, who spent years in child protection, is one of the most outspoken voices challenging the official line. He argues that the case was mishandled from the very beginning and that crucial red flags were ignored. According to him, what happened inside apartment 5A does not fit the story of a clean abduction at all. Wedger's first concern is brutally straightforward. Why were the parents never charged with child abandonment? Leaving 3 very young children, Madeleine and her 2 baby siblings, alone in a foreign apartment at night, while the adults dine nearby, is an act he describes as bang out of order. Under the UK's Children Act, it could be considered a criminal offence. To him, this is the starting point, the first alarm bell, and yet no arrest ever followed. But Wedger doesn't stop at the legal issue. He points to parental behavior, something seasoned detectives scrutinize closely. He claims that in other cases, he's witnessed the raw collapse of parents who lose a child, uncontrollable grief, despair that leaks from every pore. In contrast, he describes the McCanns' early media appearances as composed, rehearsed, even oddly detached. Jerry, he says, appeared cool and almost untouched. Kate, though visibly strained, lacked the heartbroken aura he had seen countless times before. These impressions are subjective, of course. Trauma manifests differently in every parent. But for Wedger, they were enough to push him away from the abduction narrative and toward the unsettling possibility that the truth might lie much closer to home. When investigators dug into the so-called Tapas group, the friends who dined with the McCanns that night, they found themselves facing a web of routines and stories that didn't quite fit together. On paper, the system sounded reassuring. Every 15 minutes, one of the adults would leave the dinner table, walk across the resort, and check on the children asleep in their rooms. But when detectives mapped the actual timeline, the arrangement looked confusing, even impossible. According to Jon Wedger, this wasn't a simple oversight. He believes the elaborate rota was a smokescreen, a way to present responsibility while actually creating distraction and doubt. Who checked which room, at what time, and in what order? The accounts overlapped, contradicted, and blurred. For Wedger, this kind of narrative complexity is a classic sign that a story is being constructed after the fact rather than lived in real time. Then came the Gasper Statement. This document, given to police by a fellow holidaymaker, described disturbing behavior she allegedly witnessed, inappropriate gestures, unsettling jokes, and a strange reference to Madeleine made by a doctor friend of the McCanns. While never proven in court and heavily contested, Wedger considers the statement a red flag. He argues that if a circle of friends carries shadows of impropriety, it should raise investigative urgency, not dismissal. Even stranger, the group's openness extended to shared childcare practices that shocked Wedger. Testimonies suggested that some of the men bathed children who were not their own. For a detective seasoned in child protection, this was unthinkable. He asks bluntly, what parent allows another man to bathe their infant? To him, this detail hints at a troubling dynamic within the group, one that most families would find abnormal at best, dangerous at worst. Individually, these oddities might be brushed aside, but taken together, the convoluted check system, the Gasper allegation, the permissive childcare, they formed a pattern Wedger could not ignore. They painted a backdrop of inconsistency and potential risk, and in his eyes they weakened the idea of a sudden stranger abduction, instead pointing towards something concealed within the group itself. If Part 2 raised questions about the people, then Part 3 raises questions about the evidence. One of the most unsettling details in the Madeleine McCann investigation comes from the work of specialist cadaver dogs. These animals are trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, a signal impossible to replicate with ordinary smells. When brought into the McCann's holiday apartment, a dog named Eddie, handled by Officer Martin Grimes, allegedly gave a strong alert. According to reports, the dog indicated the scent of blood and possible human remains in key locations, behind the sofa in the living room, and later inside the trunk of a car the McCanns rented weeks after Madeleine vanished. For Detective Jon Wedger, this was a bombshell. In his experience, dogs like Eddie had extraordinary accuracy, with hit rates unmatched by machines or human investigators. His conclusion? Dogs don't lie. But the implications were devastating. If the dog's alerts were reliable, they suggested that Madeleine's body had once been in both the apartment and the rental car. Wedger questions why these findings weren't treated as decisive turning points in the case. Instead, he says, critics rushed to discredit the dogs or argue contamination. Yet for him, the alerts are among the strongest indicators that something tragic happened inside the apartment, long before the abduction narrative reached the public. Compounding the suspicion was the claim that the flat had been scrubbed clean with bleach. To Wedger, this was no coincidence. Thorough cleaning after a disappearance is unusual, even suspicious, unless there is something a family desperately wishes to erase. Without forensic residue, investigators were left with little hard evidence, but the very act of erasure raised more questions than answers. The car added another layer. How could a rental obtained weeks later bear traces linked to Madeleine? For Wedger, the only plausible explanation was that a body had been transported. To others, it was noise, coincidence, or a flawed alert. But whichever side one takes, the combination of cadaver dogs, suspicious cleaning, and a tainted vehicle created a narrative far more complex than a simple snatch-and-run abduction. At the heart of Jon Wedger's theory is a chilling but strangely ordinary explanation: an accident, not an abduction. He does not imagine shadowy kidnappers scaling windows or strangers lurking in the night. Instead, he pictures a frightened little girl, perhaps restless, perhaps sedated, struggling in the dark. Wedger believes that Madeleine may have been given sedatives by her medically trained parents to help her sleep. In his eyes, this would explain why the adults felt comfortable leaving 3 children alone for long stretches. They expected them to remain unconscious. But sedatives can be unpredictable. If too much is given, or if a child builds tolerance, the line between sleep and danger can blur. In Wedger's reconstruction, Madeleine could have woken unexpectedly, panicked when she found herself alone, and tried to climb toward the window or door to reach her parents. In that frantic attempt, she may have slipped, fallen, and suffered what experts call positional asphyxia, a form of suffocation caused by the body being trapped in a position that restricts breathing. To Wedger, this is the simplest explanation for a sudden, silent death in a healthy 3-year-old. If true, the next steps might have unfolded in chaos. He suggests that the parents, terrified of losing their medical careers and reputations, chose concealment over confession. According to this theory, the room was scrubbed, the body removed, and the story of a nighttime abduction carefully staged. Wedger doesn't frame this as a calculated murder, but rather as a tragic accident followed by a catastrophic decision. In his mind, no stranger needed to slip through a tiny window. No phantom predator had to roam the Algarve that night. What happened, he argues, may have been entirely domestic, preventable, and covered up in the desperate aftermath. It is a theory that outrages some, convinces others, and remains, like everything in this case, unproven. But for Wedger, it aligns with the cadaver dog alerts, the bleaching of the flat, and the unexplained traces in the car. And it raises a haunting question. If an accident really did happen, how far would parents go to protect themselves from the truth? If Madeleine truly was abducted, the official story points to a window, a small opening in the holiday apartment that supposedly allowed a stranger to slip inside, lift the child, and escape unseen. But to Detective Jon Wedger, this scenario never added up. First, the logistics. The apartment window was narrow, awkwardly placed, and difficult even for an agile adult to climb through. To pull a drowsy or struggling 3-year-old out that way would have required strength, silence, and precision, qualities rarely present in crimes of opportunity. Add in the fact that the twins were asleep in the same room, and the risk multiplies. One cry, one sudden movement, and the intruder would have been caught in the act. Second, the timing. The Tapas group claimed they were checking the children every 15 to 20 minutes. That left only the briefest window of opportunity for an abductor to act. According to Wedger, the idea that a passing predator happened to strike at exactly the right moment, slipping in and out between parental checks, stretches probability to its breaking point. Third, the exposure. Praia da Luz was a bustling resort town. For an offender to carry a child through the streets, unseen at dinner time in a tourist area, seems to Wedger almost impossible. He argues that a clean abduction under those circumstances would require extraordinary luck or insider knowledge. Instead, Wedger returns to the principle drilled into detectives. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. In his eyes, the abduction through the window story is not simple. It is complex, risky, and unsupported by physical evidence. By contrast, his theory of an accidental death inside the apartment, followed by concealment, requires no mysterious intruder, no miraculous timing, and no flawless escape. Of course, police and prosecutors have kept the abduction line alive, pointing to suspects like Christian Bruckner years later. But Wedger insists that every time he revisits the crime scene in his mind, the same conclusion emerges. The window was never the way out. As the Portuguese inquiry stalled, the UK government launched Operation Grange, a review that soon ballooned into one of the most expensive investigations in British history. Over the years, tens of millions of pounds were poured into the case, money that could have funded hundreds of other missing children inquiries. To Jon Wedger, this extraordinary budget was itself a red flag. In his experience, the average missing child case in the UK received only hours of police time and a few £1,000s in resources. Why then did Madeleine's case command such endless attention? His answer is blunt: politics and image. The McCanns were not anonymous parents from a struggling background. They were doctors, educated, articulate, photogenic. When they spoke, cameras listened. Their connections extended into government circles, and even the Pope himself voiced support. In Wedger's eyes, this visibility transformed the case from a tragedy into a matter of national reputation. Protecting the McCanns meant protecting Britain's image abroad. Wedger argues that British police involvement in Portugal was jurisdictionally unnecessary. Child abandonment could have been prosecuted under UK law, but instead of arresting the parents, officers flew out with sniffer dogs, analysts, and public relations advisors. To him, this looked less like justice and more like damage control. And the results? After more than a decade, Operation Grange has yet to produce a conviction, a body, or even a definitive timeline. Millions spent, but no closure. For Wedger, this suggests not incompetence, but deliberate misdirection, a way to keep the case alive in public memory without ever allowing it to reach a damning conclusion. Beyond money and politics, Wedger points to the work of Peter Hyatt, an American statement analyst renowned for dissecting language. Hyatt studied transcripts of the McCann's interviews and concluded that their words contained markers of deception. In particular, he suggested that Kate McCann's language hinted at an abused childhood background, and Jerry's at manipulative tendencies. Wedger found Hyatt's analysis persuasive. In his view, the McCann's phrasing, what they emphasized, what they avoided, revealed knowledge they were not openly sharing. Hyatt even stated publicly that he believed they were lying. Yet despite his willingness to testify in court, no legal body ever called him. Adding weight, Portuguese police themselves once declared the parents arguidos, formal suspects in their daughter's disappearance. The head of their judiciary police, Gonçalo Amaral, even wrote a book outlining why he believed the McCanns were complicit. The couple tried to sue him, but he wrote another book, doubling down. For Wedger, this was telling. Why would a senior investigator risk his career and reputation on what he knew could not be proven, unless he truly believed it? Of course, none of these perspectives led to charges. British authorities consistently leaned away from parental involvement, focusing instead on the possibility of a stranger abduction. But Wedger insists the linguistic tells, the Portuguese suspicions, and the enduring absence of abduction evidence combine into one picture, that the simplest explanation was ignored. For Wedger, the Madeleine McCann case is not unique. It is part of a pattern. He compares it to other missing child tragedies where, in his view, truth was buried beneath influence, reputation, or sheer convenience. He mentions cases in the UK and Ireland where children vanished, suspects were mishandled, and vulnerable families were left without justice. In his telling, certain ingredients repeat: affluent or connected adults, confusing timelines, narratives that strain logic, and an eventual shift of focus away from the inner circle. Madeleine's case, with its high-profile parents, political interventions, and endless funding, fits the template almost too well. Wedger argues that in less glamorous settings, investigations are far harsher. He cites the case of Shannon Matthews, a British girl reported missing in 2008. Within weeks, police discovered she had been hidden by her own family in a staged abduction. The difference, he notes, was social class. Shannon's mother lived in poverty, lacked media polish, and was quickly exposed. No millions were spent protecting her image. By contrast, the McCann's standing insulated them from the same scrutiny. To Wedger, this reveals an uncomfortable truth. In child protection work, justice is not always blind. Status, connections, and presentation can shape whether parents are treated as victims or as suspects, and so he warns, unless society learns from these patterns, the next missing child may vanish into the same fog of influence and unanswered questions. For him, the Madeleine McCann case is not just a mystery. It is a mirror reflecting how far institutions will go to protect certain people, even at the cost of the truth. In policing, there's a rule of thumb. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. For Jon Wedger, that principle is the compass guiding his interpretation of the Madeleine McCann case. He looks at the official abduction narrative, a stranger slipping silently through a window, lifting a child without a sound, avoiding neighbors, evading cameras, timing it perfectly between parental checks, and he sees complexity layered upon complexity. To him, it's a scenario requiring miracle-level timing, stealth, and luck. Possible? Perhaps. Probable? Hardly. By contrast, his accidental death theory is almost mundane. A child, possibly sedated, wakes in confusion. She cries out, tries to climb, falls or suffocates, and dies suddenly in the place where she was last seen alive. Faced with that horror, parents panic, clean the scene, and construct a cover story. No need for phantoms in the night, only human fear, poor judgment, and the desire to protect reputation. Wedger even speculates that Madeleine may have died a day or two before she was reported missing. This, he argues, would explain why cadaver dogs alerted both in the apartment and later in the rental car. It would also clarify why the last sighting of her remains oddly blurred, with conflicting details from the group. Of course, without forensic confirmation, this remains a theory. Yet Wedger insists it is the scenario that best fits the evidence that does exist, and avoids the improbable gymnastics of an external abduction. To him, the case is less about a lurking predator and more about what happens when respectable appearances collide with unthinkable tragedy. Nearly 2 decades later, the most painful truth is that so much remains unknown. Where is Madeleine McCann? What exactly happened in apartment 5A? Was she taken by a stranger, as official lines maintain? Did she die accidentally, as Jon Wedger and other critics believe? Or is the truth something else entirely, still hidden beneath layers of error and secrecy? What is clear is what we don't have. No body, no confirmed timeline, no physical evidence strong enough to survive in court. The cadaver dog alerts are disputed. The Portuguese suspicions never ripened into convictions. Operation Grange has produced no breakthrough despite years of funding. German prosecutors point to Christian Bruckner, but even that case has yet to see trial or deliver closure. For Wedger, these gaps aren't just unfortunate, they're symptomatic. He sees them as proof that the investigation was steered away from uncomfortable possibilities. For others, the same gaps point the opposite way, that there was never enough evidence to implicate the parents, and the abduction hypothesis remains alive. And that is why Madeleine's story still haunts the world. It is a vacuum, a case where emotion fills the spaces evidence cannot. Until something changes, until a body is discovered, a confession is made, or a courtroom weighs facts, the McCann case will remain exactly what it is today. A hall of mirrors where theories thrive and certainty dies. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is more than a mystery. It is a wound that has never healed. For Detective Jon Wedger, the case represents everything wrong with how institutions handle child protection: unequal treatment, misplaced priorities, and a reluctance to confront the obvious. For others, it is still a live investigation, centered on external suspects and unresolved leads. Whichever view you hold, one truth remains unshakable. A little girl vanished, and 18 years later, the world still cannot say where she is or what truly happened. That silence is the greatest injustice of all. So what do we do with a case like this? We examine, we question, we refuse to accept easy answers when the evidence doesn't align. And above all, we keep the focus where it belongs, on Madeleine herself, a child who deserved safety, love, and a future. If you found this breakdown valuable, if you believe in analysis that goes deeper than headlines, then please subscribe to the channel, share this video, and join the conversation in the comments. Your voice matters, because keeping these cases alive in public memory is one of the few powers we have. And remember, every missing child deserves more than a story. They deserve the truth.